for Advanced Heresy 502. If your course schedule does not read AH 502, then you're probably in the wrong classroom and you won't appreciate this.
You anticipate 503 this fall?
There could be a continuation of this because the rabbit hole goes deep, my friends. Yeah, you're going to get your opportunity to bail on me anytime here. So somebody was like, "What? Why would you humiliate yourself by calling this heresy? Don't you realize that people will believe that?" And so let me give you an example on this, all right? I just came across this, and there's plenty of information just like this that you'll find anywhere. This is on the website evidenceforchristianity.org. And here's the question that one of their writers sets out to answer and how they answered it, okay? Here it is. Is there any evidence that Joseph of Arimathea went to the British Isles with Jesus when he was a teen? Here is the writer. Well, let me go on and read it. He rephrases the question. First of all, is there any proof that Joseph of Arimathea went to the British Isles to procure tin and took the young Jesus with him? I came across this claim presented as historical research with a significant amount of the word documentation in quotes from ancient sources. I was not aware of any evidence for these missing years in Jesus' life. Here's the answer from their scholar. Okay? I had to do a little research on this because I had never heard of this legend. And I call it legend for good reason. There is no evidence at all to support this. It is the result of pure speculation. The only source I could find on this was from an Anglican church writer who, although he is biased, would himself admit that the story is a combination of speculation and sheer invention. This author speculates that some Jewish Christians in the first century had investments in the tin trade. This seems to me a bit unlikely, but not impossible. The problem with it is that there is no evidence that is true. The only historical fact in the entire story is that in the first century, a large proportion of the tin available for making bronze in the Roman Empire did come from Cornwall in England. I have not seen the particular claim, but I would imagine that this is the documentation you're referring to. Okay, so what do you say to this guy? He's a scholar, and he has just said right out, the only thing I could find on this was from one writing from the Anglican Church, and it was admittedly based on speculation and invention. How do you answer that? Well, I would say a couple of things. First of all, the writer who makes this response obviously didn't do very much research. And you don't even have to dig that deep to find the sort of things we've been studying. And secondly, the writer that he found as his source hadn't done much research. But my better answer for it is, okay. That's my best answer. And back to the old rabbit hole story, red pill or blue pill? Right? You guys already hooked onto this one. Take the red pill and what happens? You see how deep that rabbit hole goes. Take the blue pill. I love this. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and you believe whatever you want to believe. And that's what people do, isn't it? But the truth is, you get a wake-up call on anything like history or what's really going on in the world around you, and suddenly your perspective on everything gets a shift, doesn't it? And so, like I said, this research I've been digging into for just about the last 10 years, and every day now that I'm doing research on this, I find more information. And it's not that I'm any renowned scholar or anything. I just do a little digging on it, and one thing leads to the next, which leads to another, and you get a name here connected with a place there, and you dig into that, and suddenly you find a whole new group of sources of information from earlier documents and that sort of thing, and you just keep compiling all of that. That's how you do it, right? And so the guy who was writing that, I feel bad that that's the level of scholarship that people get usually on anything that seems significant that they're digging into, especially something like history. But I just thought you would enjoy me sharing that little excerpt with you there, since you've been doing a little research on this. In your handout that you have tonight, the second half of the second page, I listed a few sources there, references that you can do some additional research if you want to. And I'll try to go over those before we're done today and just mention a little bit about each of those. Let me just jump right into this. I'm calling this the earliest missionaries because the story I've told on several occasions, and that is when Joseph and some companions of his were exiled from Judea or from Israel, about 35 to 36 AD. There were several things taking place there. Is the time when the persecution had increased in Israel, right after the stoning of Stephen, right after Pontius Pilate was reassigned to a new area, and the high priest increased what they were doing so far as the persecutions. So just a couple of things I want to start with, and then we'll get into some actual digging into this, okay? First of all, the epitaph for Joseph of Arimathea at Glastonbury Abbey. Obviously, it was not written by him because it was written after he was dead, right? So the critique on that, they're saying, how could he have written that? Most people don't write their own epitaph. If they do, they write it as a past tense about themselves, right? Awaiting the appropriate time. But generally, a loved one or close associate or friend will write the epitaph. So, in Latin, but then translated to English. I came to the Britons after I had buried the Christ. I taught. I have entered, literal on my rest, but I have entered into my rest. So that's the short epitaph for Joseph of Arimathea. That has been moved at least a couple of times from the relocation of Glastonbury Abbey, or the original church that was at Glastonbury, moved once, and then again after that burn in around 1184 to what was the later established Glastonbury Abbey. So it is not on its original location there, but it's in the same vicinity. It's, nearby for sure. Here's another thing, and I've touched on this. I just wanted to I'm throwing in a few tidbits here to enrich your interest a little bit. When Paul arrived in Britain around 63 AD, if you remember, he was at the Palatium Britannicum there, kind of in a exile or house arrest situation, but absolutely living in royal luxury at the time. I saw a thing this week where somebody was teaching a study on Paul's life, and he was mentioned one of the prison epistles, and he said, look at this. Paul wrote all this from a dirty, filthy, stinking Roman prison. And I would have had no qualms with that a few years ago, but after kind of knowing, I'm like, well, it wasn't too much dirty and filthy and stinking in the place he was staying. And then Luke mentions in Acts, not only did he stay there, he also had a rented house of his own where he entertained guests and taught from in Rome. But anyway, as you know, he was allowed freedom and charges dismissed, and we were told he traveled west, and many thought that was an indication that he had gone to Glastonbury, or there in England. And so I brought this in. But then he ended up back in Rome around, 65, 66. It was about 68 when Nero restarted his persecutions. Paul and many others were then killed. But notice this. This was one of the writings. When the Apostle Paul arrived in Britain in 63 AD to preach the word, he was met by certain educated Druids who informed him of their descent from the house of Israel. These Druids had already been converted earlier under the ministry of Joseph of Arimathea and his companions as early as 37 or 38 AD. And as I keep reiterating, it seems that Joseph arrived after his exile back at Cornwall there, Glastonbury specifically, about in 37 AD, and that's when he began his ministry and started seeing the conversions, and then hundreds and then thousands of people were coming there to be taught, instructed, and sent out as missionaries. That's why I call some of this the earliest missionaries. So I've got two quotes here that are sort of highlighted. I'm going to read this first one, and while it's got some good stuff in it, there's also a couple of flagrant historical errors in it. I want to see if you can catch those, all right? All right, here we go. There is no doubt that this tradition, much as it is given in the life of Rabanus, was accepted by the whole Latin church. First of all, you just got another source here to look up, didn't you, for more study on this? The life of Rabanus, correct? It was accepted by the whole Latin church for over 1,000 years. For proof of this, we have only to turn to the breviary at St. Martha's Day, July 29th. There we find a lection for the second nocturne, which tells how Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, with their servant Marcella and Maximin, one of the 72 disciples, were seized by the Jews, placed in a boat without sails or oars, and carried safely to the port of Marseille. Moved by this remarkable fact, the people of the neighboring lands were speedily converted to Christianity. Lazarus became bishop of Marseille, Maximum of Aix. Mary lived and died in Anchorus, I have no idea what an Anchorus is, on a high mountain of those parts, while Martha founded a convent of women and died on the 4th day before the calends of August and was buried with great honor at Tarascon, from the book The Coming of the Saints. Okay. Find me a historical error in that's easy for anyone to pick out. Remember, this is 1st century. What existed and didn't exist? Well, that's okay. I'm cool with the date there. That's fine.
They didn't have Judaism.
Well, they didn't land in Marseille before they went to Egypt before they.
Well, ultimately they ended up there at Marseille. Okay, ultimately that's where they ended up.
Well, it implied that they weren't just put out in a boat.
Okay, it doesn't really fill in any details there. Granted, it's just missing information there. They're not a gross historical error. Let me, yes, Deb. Well, not the way we understand it today, but as I mentioned, Linus was consecrated there as the Bishop of Rome by Paul. And Lazarus was historically known as the bishop there at Marseille in France. So we're good there. And this is just a small thing that helps you pick out some of the bias of history. Okay, it's in this last sentence. Martha founded a convent of women. This is 1st century. When did they first start building convents? Hundreds of years after this. So how in the world would Mary, in this particular case, they're referring to Mary Magdalene, have founded a convent which there was no such thing as a convent for what? 1,000 years later? Okay, so you missed that, right? But now that I mention it, you're all over it. And you'll catch something like that the next time, right? You're going to have to get up mighty early to get one over on you, I'm sure. But what I'm pointing out is the kind of stuff to watch for when you're reading historical documents and that sort of thing, especially when it's somebody from a later time reporting on an earlier history. Just like there was one that said that Mary went to Linus, and he was the bishop there in Rome, and he took her confession. Do you get what I'm saying? What's wrong with that statement? When did the whole confessional thing begin? What year? Well, I don't know, but it was not then. It was close 1,000 years or more after this, right? And so to impose things as happening in those dates that didn't even exist then shows us that the writer is deliberately trying to slant that, but sometimes the writer actually believes that and just doesn't know any better. And what does that tell you about the writer? They haven't done a whole lot of scholarly research on that and enough to be objective about it, you know. And going back to the writer who wrote that thing is saying, there is absolutely no shred of evidence that any of this ever happened. It's pure speculation and invention. And you guys have been digging through evidence on this stuff for, what, a couple of months here. What would you say in response to, there's zero evidence? And the only thing I could find was one writing from some guy in the Church of England or the Anglican Church. What would you say in response to that? Okay, you didn't dig very deep, Davey.
Okay, since I'm being open-minded and objective, but couldn't the confession in the convent just also be things that happened under a different name or without a name, just like, and that's what it was called later. You know, I mean, this happened in, well, that's like the convent, or that happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just like July 29th.
But
July 29th didn't happen then either. I mean,
it was a different name for it. But let's go back to the taking someone's confession. I mean, what could there possibly be under another name in the world of Christianity? But granted, it's possible, let's say Mary started a shelter for women who have been widowed. Okay? She could have done something like that. But in the definition of convent, that, you know, probably not. But yeah, granted, that's good. That's very good. Wes?
Well, the question you're talking about before we go back to this one, you're going to find what you're looking for.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you're not looking for it, you won't find it.
That's true. No matter what it is, you're pretty much going to find what you're looking for. And, you know, if you're looking for something that doesn't exist and you're objective and honest, you'll just go away in disappointment, but you'll probably keep looking and eventually find it maybe, right? Okay. So that first paragraph that I just read through there, anything else stand out with you in that? I think that one in the end of it there about Mary founding a convent was what I wanted you to catch. All right? Just, yes, Debbie. Well, that's another, you know, you have to start looking at these things. So which is true? Because we know she ended up in Britain with Joseph, and this has got her where? In France. We're fairly certain that Mary, the mother of Jesus, ended up in France and died there, but not Mary Magdalene, whom this is referring to. Here's what I'm seeing. And the more I dig into history, and the further removed we get from it, when you get either two places with the same name or two people with the same name, let's say we've got two people named Jim Canyo, and they're separated by 250 years, okay? And their stories can't be the same, right? But you later reading on it, you've got stories of Jim Canyo doing things that were obviously in the 1990s, okay? But you've also got stories of him fighting in the Civil War, okay? And you're thinking, dude, lived a long time. Or you say, wait a minute. They're conflating the stories of two different people and merging those together, but it can't be so. There's no way this dude could have fought in the Civil War, disco danced in the 70s, and bought cool shades in the 90s, right?
You don't know the Jim Canyon.
But you see what I'm getting at. What I find a lot of times is when I'm digging through history is somebody has picked up on the same name and conflated it together with another one, and they might be a century apart, or they might just be two different people with the same or similar name in different places, or whose paths did cross, and in the crossing of paths, they just merge them together into one a lot of times. We see that a lot, don't we? And we've touched on some of those examples throughout this. And so we've got to be careful not to do the same thing. Jim Canyon wants to speak on his own behalf now.
I wanted to go back to Martha there.
All right.
About finding
Okay.
I don't recall ever hearing in the Old Testament that there were any nuns. Or the convent Jews, the nuns.
Yeah, that was the place of training and where the nuns would stay and so forth, which was a much, much later development in Catholicism. Yeah, definitely not in the first century. We didn't even, there wasn't even any Catholicism in the first century.
Speaking about Jim Canyon, there was a rumor going around that he was a sneaking, drinking disco deacon.
There you go. I went to look up myself on Google once, and I found I was an NFL player, you know, that I'd never heard of, you know. There's some NFL guy named Tony Blevins, a little darker skin than mine, but same guy though. You see what I'm getting at? Contemporary, but just not me. Jim Potter.
How could they have been placed on a ship without sails or oars and be carried safely?
Well, again, this is a historical account that does two things. It assumes a lot and leaves out some details. My version of that and this from reading several different accounts, okay, let me give you a couple of examples, okay. My understanding was they were put on a boat, not a very nice boat. Some accounts have called it a makeshift raft. Others just said a boat without oars or sails, and towed out by a ship into the Mediterranean and left. Okay. Another account says that some of these disciples were able to escape those efforts by getting on a ship with Joseph of Arimathea and sailing before they got exiled. Okay? I don't think that happened. I'm pretty sure it didn't happen. But there are some accounts that read something like that. I mean, it would be easy enough to conflate that into it, knowing that he had ships and knowing that he had that capacity. But I think at this particular point in time, he had been arrested and miraculously escaped, we're told, if you believe the non-canonical book called the Gospel of Nicodemus and his historical account of what happened there. That's what he said. And that's where I got my version of it, and along with several other sources.
Well, you say it was a miracle, just like John the Revelator was given. They tried to
Yeah, he survived. Yeah, yeah. They sealed Joseph in a cell. They locked it and put a seal on it, and discovered he was gone and the seal unbroken. Is what happened with that. So, but yeah, I'm saying you will find many versions of that account. Somewhere one is the actual original, and we'll probably find out that all of us got some of the details wrong, reaching that far back into history. But I think in general, we've got, a multiplicity of accounts of the individuals on this particular boat that happened. And we're going to get to that in a little more detail and describe the people a little bit. I can't really identify everybody who's listed as a passenger on that. There's a couple of different accounts of who the passengers actually were, but only variation is one or two people, not the whole crew. Okay, here's another quote. The manuscript records that in this year, Lazarus, Mary Magdalene, Martha her handmaiden Marcella, Maximin, a disciple, Joseph, the decurion of Arimathea, against all of whom the Jewish people had special reasons of enmity, were exposed to the sea in a vessel without sails or oars. This vessel drifted finally to Marseille, and they were saved. From Marseille, Joseph and his company passed into Britain, and after preaching the gospel there, died. Well, that's a rather terse account of his life, isn't it? They moved through the details rather quickly, but they're not too far off on that. They just left a few things out. Okay, so let's go to page 2, all right? So we get to the point where Joseph and some of his companions are exiled. That's about to happen in our tracking through this history. And so I'm going to get some of the stage set for that. First of all, let's go to the book of Acts, chapter 7, verse 55, okay? So, the big deal about the stoning of Stephen Sorry, I'm in my wrong book. Don't know why I did that. The big deal about the stoning of Stephen was this. They violated Roman law. They were not allowed to execute or put anyone to death. But they crossed that line with Stephen. And why do you suppose the Jews crossed the line with Stephen? What had he just done whenever they stoned him? Do you remember he gets up and preaches to them, inspired by the Holy Spirit, to the leaders of the Jews and everybody, and he just gives a history lesson. He talks about Abraham, he goes to Moses and the Exodus and the prophets and all of this, and finally to the Messiah and him coming in the person of Jesus, and then he says, and you have crucified the King of glory. You, with wicked hands, have put him to death. And that's when they began to move in on him. And then he said, oh, look, I see heavens open, and there's Jesus standing at the right hand of the Father right there. And that was enough, right? So they stoned him. Here it is, verse 55 in Acts chapter 7 through 60. But he, being full of the Holy Ghost, looked up steadfastly into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing on the right hand of God. And he said, behold, I see the heavens open and the Son of Man standing on the right hand of God. Then they cried with a loud voice and stopped their ears and ran upon him with one accord and cast him out of the city and stoned him. And the witnesses laid down their clothes at a young man's feet whose name was Saul. And they stoned Stephen, calling upon God and saying, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. And he kneeled down and cried with a loud voice, Lord, lay not this sin to their charge. And when he had said this, he fell asleep. And about this time is when they started this practice. They couldn't legitimately kill, or they would bring down the crushing power of Rome on all of their authority and government and everything else, right? And they violated that with Stephen. And they immediately began resorting to this. We're not going to kill anybody. We're just going to take them out in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea and leave them. So that was how that sort of developed. And then notice how the persecution really intensifies. The other thing that's going on at this time is when Pilate is being removed and reassigned to a different location. Saul was consenting to his death. And at that time, there was a great persecution against the church, which was at Jerusalem. I would say don't read this passage lightly. At that time, there was a great persecution against the church which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. What if history said at that particular time there was a great persecution against the church and the Christians in Stone County, Missouri? How would that look on our lives? I'd say we'd be living through some very dark times should that be the way I don't think our history is going to read that way. It could, but I'm just simply saying if it did. And we can read over a passage of scripture like this in a couple of seconds and go on like nothing really happened. People were being killed. People were being dragged from their homes and persecuted and tortured and made to say things they didn't mean and turn against family members. There was evil and violence going on, and the only motivation for it was they were followers of Christ. Okay. Verse 2, and devout men carried Stephen to his burial, and they made great lamentation over him. This is a big deal. As for Saul, now who's Saul? Later Paul the Apostle. As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering into every house, hailing men and women, and committed them to prison. Therefore, they that were scattered abroad went everywhere, preaching the word. You follow this? This was the earliest missionaries, the beginning of the first missionary movement. What brought it on? Persecution, being forced out of the place of comfort, place of home. And so as this persecution intensifies is when Joseph got arrested. I wouldn't doubt that what Saul was somehow involved in his arrest and imprisonment. He ends up being miraculously rescued or miraculously escaping, however you want to say it from that. And then later they round him and several others up, and this is what they've been doing, is pulling these boats out into the Mediterranean with people on them. And so Joseph gets rounded up in that. Now he was not just a nobody. They spoke of him as a top Roman official. Some even say he literally owned the mines in Cornwall. I'm not so sure if that's true or not. But some accounts read it that way, so obviously some thought that. But he was the manager of the Roman mining districts. He was extremely wealthy. He had connections all over the world. And not only that, look at his family, with his dad and his connections, wealth, and his connection on the council in Jerusalem, which was probably in chaos by this time, had been since the crucifixion, I'm guessing. Because they were doing big cover-up and all that every day after that. That never happens in our world today. But as the story goes, and there are a few different accounts of this. One of the most well-known accounts of the boat with no sails or oars, and Joseph and others being on it, is actually published by a Roman Catholic cardinal, Cardinal Baronius, in around 18th century. So much, much later that's published, but he actually cites earlier sources, and even a couple of sources that he states are from the Vatican Library. There has never been an official refutation or recanting of Cardinal Baronius's account of this. Do you follow what I'm saying here? Okay, if they were that opposed to this story or thought they had big evidence otherwise, the Vatican could have easily refuted this, but they really didn't. So I just chose Cardinal Baronius's account here as one. There are others, though, okay? And here's who he lists as being on the boat with Joseph. And he called everybody saint, and I just left it there kind of tongue-in-cheek. By the way, who's a saint? Every believer in Jesus Christ. You don't have to be dead so many years and have performed miracles and have a church council or whatever, hold a hearing to have evidence presented and all that, and then declare you a saint. The moment you believed on Jesus Christ, the creator of the universe declared you a saint. Nobody else's opinion matters, right? Okay, so I went in and just left the saint there on each of these because that's the source, all right? First one, Mary, wife of Cleopas. Oh, but wait, who's Cleopas? It's another Mary. Cleopas is mentioned a time or two in the New Testament Gospels, right? Okay, so I'm sure I'll learn more on this, but my best take on who Cleopas is she was either sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus, or half-sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus. And here's why I say this. Several accounts seem to indicate that Mary, mother of Jesus, her parents, her mother had had 3 different husbands. And in each case, she had children. And she had a daughter named Mary from each of the 3. And one of them is Mary, the wife of Cleopas.
So she had, for sure, 3 sisters named Mary.
Well, half sisters. No, 2. Because she was one of the 3.
Okay, so 2.
Mixing up my math on me here. That's tricky. Don't do that. But yeah. So that's apparently Anna liked the name Mary. So there's a few of these, and I'm not sure they are. Now, Baronius's account does not mention Mary, the mother of Jesus, although every other account I can find does include her in the list. So, just throwing that out there. She apparently was there because we find her in France when the others are there, and she stays there, you know. Anyway, we'll get to that. Saint Eutropius, I'm not real sure who Eutropius is. And Salome, she's mentioned a time or two in the New Testament, and is the mother, believed to be the mother of James and John, the sons of both. Sons of thunder, sons of Zebedee, exactly. Which would make Salome the wife of whom? Zebedee, we think, or else there's other possibilities, right? But the easiest answer to that is they two were married. St. Martial, this is not the first century writer, Martial, that was the prolific Roman author, although they were contemporaries and knew some of the same people. This guy was being exiled out of Judea, and he was not a Roman, the best I can tell. So I've got to do a little more digging to figure out just who this guy was. I haven't found that out yet. Same thing with Trophimus, Cleon, Saturninus, and Maximum. I think the account I had in this listed him as the blind man. However, notice the thing that we just read listed Maximum as someone else. Notice this? Exactly. Okay. So that would make him not that. Other accounts say Restitutus, aka Sidonius, was the man born blind. Then we have Mary Magdalene, her sister Martha, her brother Lazarus, and Marcella, the maid to Martha and Mary. How many people is that? Oh, and Joseph, of course. We're assuming his presence there. What's that? Well, it couldn't row it if it was. It had to have like a dozen people on it. Yeah. How many of you got a boat? How many of you can put a dozen people in your boat? All right, there you go. I mean, you could. Some of you say, well, I could, but I wouldn't necessarily just choose to do that every time I go out, right? There is a tourist attraction in France, and again, you're going to see, I want you to sort this out for me, okay? Just with your reasoning and a few tidbits of history. And Les Saintes Marie de la Mer was indeed the place where Mary Jacob, Mary Salome, and Mary Magdalene landed after their flight from Palestine. Again, error there, Israel, whatever. The three Marys escaped persecution to which Christians were subject in the Holy Land, and however were forced into exile. The Romans sent them away on a makeshift raft that drifted across the Mediterranean. It eventually ran aground on the shore of Camargue in a land known as Opidimura Notre Dame de Ratis. And Ratis in Gallic means raft. Okay, the place became known as Notre Dame de la Barque, and changed name until 1838, when the name was changed to Sainte Marie de la Mar. True or false? Okay, so my paraphrasing of this. There is this location, Les Saintes Marie de la Mar, in France, and they claim it was the place where Mary Jacob, Mary Salome, and Mary Magdalene, all three Marys, landed after their exile from Israel on a makeshift raft that the Romans, did it say the Romans that forced them onto? I would say it would have been the Jewish leaders doing this, but it may have had the collusion of the Romans on it. It eventually ran aground there in France, near Marseille, and they've named this place there, and if you take a tour, they will take you to that place and tell you this story. So who are those three Marys that it mentions? Mary Salome, you know who she is, right? Okay. Sister or half-sister? But we just go ahead and use the word sister or brother for half and step and everything else, right? Okay. And who was the other one, though? Mary Jacob. You got Mary Magdalene listed, but the other one, Mary Jacob, they mentioned. I'm thinking it could have been Mary, Mother of Jesus. I've never heard her referred to by that, but that's what this French story says, okay? Just giving you an idea of the stuff you wade through historically when you're trying to find things out, right? But nevertheless, they've got this place there named for the three Marys. And the story behind that, of them being exiled from Palestine, or there was no Palestine in the first century, but everybody still does that, Judea in the first century, on a makeshift raft, forced out to sea, and they eventually made it to France. I'm simply saying this. Here's what I get out of the story. At this particular spot in France, there is a place, and they have a legend associated with that, that the story bears a remarkable similarity to many other stories, both with the people involved and the geography involved, the timing, and everything else. I would say there's a common truth in each of the stories, and some details that are probably legend and misplaced, and some things like that that we can't quite sort out. But in general, I say there's some truth to the story. That's how I would read it. You may not. Yes, sir, Gary.
I have some trouble with mechanics of this. Israel is over here, then Italy's in the Mediterranean, and Italy's in the way, and France is all the way over here. They drifted? I don't believe that.
No, I don't think so. There's stories like that. My version of the story is this one, which there's a few accounts that concur with this. And that is, they made landfall in North Africa. I had thought it was a little bit further west, but some say it was very close to Marmor, where Joseph's other residents had been. That's why, did any of you do a search engine search on Joseph de Marmor? Okay. Sometime you'll do that and you'll see what you find. Nevertheless, that was his other residence. He had a place there. He had a center of business operations there. He visited there frequently. It was either there or a little bit further west on the North African coast. And then he arranged passage on a real boat from there to meet Philip the Evangelist and others there in Gaul or South France. That account makes more sense to me than they just drifted and one day landed in France. Yeah, unless I don't know the currents and everything in the Mediterranean, but I have sailed the Mediterranean. I have crossed the Mediterranean at least 4 times. And it takes a little while, even on a powered ship, you know?
They had to take on fresh water and food somewhere.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And to just be at sea all that long, nobody would have survived without, so, and I'm thinking it would make sense. It would have been that far to drift to have made it to North Africa from Israel, obviously, especially if it was there in Marmor in that area, which is, Egypt. So that wouldn't have been all that far away. That makes a lot more sense. They would have made landfall somewhere like that, and then arrange passage to get to where they wanted to go. So I think they went to France intentionally. They were able to make landfall. And for all I know, they were able to flag a passing boat or a ship and be pulled into shore there in North Africa rather than just randomly land there, right? I mean, so.
He was, an experienced ship owner, so.
Yeah, he had sailed the world many times.
He may have just made some, sails and helped sail it too.
Well, yeah, he wasn't completely helpless, I'm thinking. He was a resourceful man and a bit desperate at the time, too. Desperation and resourcefulness come together. It's amazing what can happen.
And he had connections all over the place.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, a ship coming by, he made that connection, but it went there.
Oh, absolutely. I'm just saying, separating legend from fact and reasoning through. And in a lot of cases, what we're doing is taking all the evidence that we have and sorting through that and trying to determine what was the most likely story out of all of the different accounts that we can find there, right? And so I think the version I presented is probably more plausible than this one that they tell at the historical tourist attraction in France, that the three Marys were just thrown on a makeshift raft from Israel, and one day they landed here in France. So, yeah. I mean, it kind of happened, but there's definitely some missing pieces there, so for what it's worth. Okay, so I've gone through some of those. Let's see, I had just a couple before I get, do I have time? Not much. Okay, I'm going to read you another account. Okay, this one is from, I think this is from the book, The Coming of the Saints by J.W. Taylor. Okay, here it is. The whole story of the subsequent journey of Joseph and his 11 companions from, again, Palestine to Britain has been convincingly traced out by J.W. Taylor in his The Coming of the Saints. And he shows that driven from Palestine at the time of the persecution, which resulted in Stephen's martyrdom, he followed the exact route of the tin trade described by Diodorus Siculus, and at every main stopping place along that route, Taylor shows traditions of his visit still remain. So they're somehow putting Joseph as navigating this entire trip in that account, right? The Bethany family, who's the Bethany family? And one or two servants with them, right? Okay. And so, Bethany family, St. Joseph of Arimathea, and according to some other traditions, St. Zacchaeus undertook a longer journey beyond Rome as far as the neighborhood of Marseille, that Salome, the mother of James, is said to have accompanied them between 34 AD and 44 AD. Lazarus is asserted to have accompanied Joseph. The only record we possess of him beyond the scripture narrative, the tradition of the Church of Lyons makes him return with Martha and Mary to Marseille, of which town he became the first bishop and there died. But other than that, they're saying the only record we possess of him beyond the scripture is in a very ancient British triad. That's the name of a document. The triad of Lazarus. The three councils of Lazarus. Believe in God who made thee, love God who saved thee, fear God who will judge thee. That's the triad of Lazarus. It is difficult to explain how the name and counsel of Lazarus could find their way into these peculiarly British memorials except by his presence and teaching in Britain. Fair enough. In The Coming of the Saints by J.W. Taylor, the author traces the travels of Joseph and his companions from the Holy Land to the White Isle. I've never heard of it referred to that way before. But the isle where Glastonbury and Cornwall is, apparently at some point was referred to as the White Isle. Do you know what other name they have for that island, right?
But aren't there the White Cliffs of Dover, or is that?
A different thing there. Well, England is a British Isles, or several. We're talking about this particular isle, Avonlea. That's the name. He convincingly demonstrates that the route of the flight from the persecution in Judea, the party followed the path of the tin trade. Again, he quotes from the life of Rabbinus, where the author tells us that the Magdalene was set adrift in a boat off the coast of Israel with 13 other members of Jesus' entourage. Lazarus, Joseph of Arimathea, Mary the wife of Cleopas, Salome and her maid, Martha and her maid, Trophimus, Maximin, Cleon, Eutropius, Sidonius, Marshall, and Saturnius. They were seized by the Jews, placed in a boat without sails or oars, carried safely to the port of Marseille. Lazarus became bishop of Marseille, Maximus of Aix. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, never heard of the place. Mary lived and died on a high mountain of those parts. Traditions of the passing of Joseph and his companions are to be found at other stopping places on the route. And that's it. That's an account from, what did I name the book there? It is The Coming of the Saints by J.W. Taylor. It's not in my list of references, by the way. That's kind of, I've heard it referred to in some of my research time or two. I haven't dug into that and read it myself yet. Just excerpts like this from it, which are kind of hard to follow if you want to know my opinion. But here's something else that we know. I'm going to wrap up on this and hit these references. That there were people coming from other locations there to where Joseph was in Cornwall. And he ended up starting a school there. And there were people coming there by the hundreds to be instructed. And he was just assigning them places to go to take the gospel. They were saying, what next? Apparently they have mapped out where they needed to send people or whatever. And he did that the rest of his life there. And they also, in addition to this growing school, built a library there. You've heard me mention that. Apparently the missionaries who were traveling out, as they would come back, would bring volumes of what they had, of their journals and what they had accomplished and done, plus books that they had picked up and writings they had picked up from their travels. All in that library there at Glastonbury, which was destroyed in, I think, around 1184 by fire. I think that was probably one of the great treasures of knowledge in the world that got destroyed then. Man, if you could go back and just see the wealth of information there. But this was probably the greatest missionary movement in the entire history of the church. We don't really know how long it went on, but we know that the school and library there lasted, over 1,000 years before it was burned. So there we are. Oh, the references for research. This first one by David Mykoff, The Life of St. Mary Magdalene and of her sister Martha, a medieval biography. It's kind of cool. It does contain some other documents going back to the 9th century. Many of them have Lazarus and Martha and sometimes Mary spreading the gospel in southern France. Again, we've got a little bit of mystery there, Debbie, in that I have maintained that Mary was with Joseph in Britain, and yet she keeps showing up in France. I mean, it's not impossible to travel back and forth, though, so both could be true. I'm just simply saying I can't fully reconcile that, okay? This is a good author to pick up on. That's E. Raymond Capt. He's the author of several historical volumes, good historian, Traditions of Glastonbury, The Biblical Missing Years of Christ. Answered, that is. And he does do a lot of research himself about Jesus and Joseph in Jesus' teen years, visiting and spending time there in England, and is one of the main sources on that, but not the only one. But within his work, you'll find other sources to open up as well. So that's kind of cool. Next source, Robert Jones, Joseph of Arimathea, Biblical and Legendary Accounts. Arthur Edel, The 10 Islands, in a publication called The Prophetic Telegraph, number 77. Apparently there's a whole number of those, and you can find them all online. John Kaiser, Joseph of Arimathea and David's Throne in Britain. A deep, long, lengthy volume with lots of amazing research in it, published by Hope of Israel Ministries. And then W.M.H. Milner, The Royal House of Britain and Enduring Dynasty. Some very interesting stuff you'll get into. Here's one last little interesting thing, and that was that one story was that Joseph, in his visits to the 10 islands and the 10 mines there, one thing he did was taught them a technique in their smelting process to better refine the tin they were mining, and then he was buying that from them. That's an interesting thing, isn't it? So anyway, I'm going to wrap up there. Again, one of the biggest mysteries for me is that the 10 miners and the smelters and all of them, they were not Gentiles. They were descendants of the house of Israel, and they were referred to as Jews by everybody. Even up until today, they call the remains of the old smelting houses the Jew houses. One of the big mysteries for me is these places had been in existence a long time before Joseph started traveling there, and they were already being ran by the Jews. There's even some of the historical accounts that say the mining community there were subject only to the laws that referred to the mining community and not the rest of the laws of the land. They had their own separate jurisdiction. That's pretty wild, isn't it? Okay, I'm wrapping it up with that. This concludes Advanced Heresy AH 502. You can mark that off in your course syllabus. Everybody passes.